Okay, Patrick, you're all set.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. It being 7:02, let's get this party started. Call to order Little Compton Housing Trust for July meeting. By way of roll call, Andrew Moore.
Here.
Claudia McNeil.
Here.
Susan Boddington.
Here.
Isabel Mattia.
You're on mute, Isabel.
Sorry, I'm here. Hi.
I also see that we have Annette Bourne here this evening representing Housing Works Rhode Island. Welcome.
Hi, Annette.
And Pierre Felstad.
Yes, I'm glad to join you.
All right, very good. And might I inquire as to in what capacity you're with us this evening?
So
I'm sorry, Pear is actually a consultant with Housing Works on the Little Compton contract.
Oh, very good.
You'll see the value of his work tonight. So
very good. Well, welcome, Pierre.
Thank
Welcome.
you.
Everyone was given a copy of our last meeting, which was on May 13th of 2021. And I'd like to thank Isabel for all the work she put into gathering all the information up for this evening. So does anyone have any comments, concerns regarding the minutes from that May meeting? Could we entertain a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
I'll second.
All in favor? Claudia McNeil,
Aye.
Andrew Moore,
Aye.
Susan Boddington,
Aye.
Isabel Mattia,
Hi.
and I'll vote aye as well. Thank you, everyone. Item number 2 on tonight's docket is a treasurer's report. Andrew, I don't know if you had occasion to check in on the current balance in the account.
Well, I was a little late in requesting it, so they didn't get back to me today. I emailed Joe around noon, but didn't hear back, and I also reached out to Tony, but I think it's appropriate that when I do hear, I can just send it out to the group, but no response from everyone.
Okay.
That's all right.
All right. Yep. No problem.
The last number we had was 125.
Right.
And it's going to be, that was a few months ago, so that was it's going to be well above that because building seasons come back, and I think that there have been quite a number of permits pulled. So,
And pretty sizable permits at that too, I would suggest. So yeah, very good. All right, thank you, Andrew. Number 3 on tonight's docket is an update on Housing Works Rhode Island proposal and plan. I don't know if there is someone who'd like to take the floor.
sure, I'll start.
Very good.
So
Thank you.
again, good evening to all of you. My name is Annette Bourne. I'm the Research and Policy Director for Housing Works Rhode Island at Roger Williams University. I'm joined tonight by Dr. Per Felstad, who is a consultant on the project with us, and his day job is a lecturer at the University of New Hampshire, though he is a resident of Providence, Rhode Island. So I conducted 8 stakeholder interviews, 2 of the parties here who I interviewed, and 6 additional. They were all asked the same 8 questions. Each interview lasted for about an hour. They were recorded, and then they were automatically transcribed by Zoom. I used my notes. I used the transcript to compile the summary report, which I believe has been sent to you, and identified themes. One of the questions very specifically asked for thoughts about what we should ask in the survey, which is your policy action step 1A in the town's comprehensive plan. So I think you'll see within the draft of the survey that Per is going to share tonight, the themes that came up in the course of those conversations, as well as just some of the kind of, I'm going to say demographic area, but it's really more about like who constitutes who's taking the survey. It isn't really a full demographic of the town. So, we are, recommending that the survey be available in a variety of methods. We're planning to upload the survey into a software called Qualtrics, which would allow for it to be available on people's phones as a web link. And of course, if you wanted to do it as a paper survey, I know you have a very active senior center. You know, people could take it as on paper as well. The idea is to get as much participation as possible, and we'd love your feedback on and some of the questions, as Per will walk you through, you'll see some of them are just, you know, multiple choice questions. Some of them are what are called logic questions. So you don't trigger the next question unless you've answered yes or no to a prior question. And then some of them are a ranking where we ask your opinion about strategies, and we ask, you know, for you to rank in order. So, but the goal would be, you know, to get as many responses as possible that is as reflective of the town as possible. And if we do paper surveys as well, I just will ask that we would need to build in a little time for us to then input that in the final report, because it would mean manually, you know, you can't just download it from Qualtrics. You would have to manually input it. And so once Per does his presentation, either you all can, you know, discuss, you know, without us, what you would want changed, or if you like it the way it is, but then we would have to decide logistics of when we can get it, you know, ramped up to be available, and, you know, for how long it would be available based on the information, you know, from all of the stakeholders. It sounded like if we had it available, you know, between as soon as we can get it out now to Labor Day. But again, I would leave that to all of you. And of course, we could do various check-ins along the way, a week in, 2 weeks in, and give you guys an idea of how much participation there's been, so that if you all feel that you need to be much more proactive in getting it disseminated, you know, you can make that decision. So can I have Per start then? Or was,
Please, yeah, that would be great.
Is there any questions about the interview summaries? Is everybody okay? Did everybody get a chance? Okay.
Yes.
So let me jump in here and describe a little bit my work on this project. I've been in consultation with Annette throughout when we were identifying what the questions that made up the backbone of the interviews themselves, to reviewing the transcripts of those after Annette had conducted those, to reviewing the ways in which Annette picked out illustrations and themes from those transcripts to identify what seemed to be rubbing points or issues or concerns, things that people cared about, that seemed to be on the horizon as possible steps forward or strategies for addressing this issue. And against that background, we composed a draft of a survey that I'd like to share with you today that has a number of main sections. The opening section, like most surveys, collects information a little bit about the length of your time in Little Compton, other demographic information, before shifting into questions as to what you might see as the relevant issues related to keeping or developing affordable homes in Little Compton, and then ending at the end of the survey with some assessments of the degree of fit that various strategies might have for addressing those concerns. So the easiest sort of visual step for me to take, and I'll do that soon, is to share my screen, which has got kind of a preview vision of the draft of the survey. And we can actually sort of go through the individual questions that way. There are other ways that you can review them both during the meeting and after the meeting as you think through the appropriateness of the sections and of the questions, in that the preview link is something that I can share. And so it can be looked at later if you'd like to look at it in closer detail. And there also are some text documents that we use to upload the questions. And so if it's easier to look at it that way, you're welcome to do it as well. There's one other issue that I want to just address because Annette asked me to bring some thoughts on this matter to the meeting, which is how many responses might we need or want to get in order for this survey to be valid, if in fact the questions that we're proposing to ask are the kinds of questions that you on the Housing Trust would like to get answers on. And a simple answer to that question is sort of this standard statistical formula. It's sort of very neat and tidy, and it's used in a lot of social scientific studies to determine if you're going to use a standard confidence interval of 95%, then you'd like to have the error rate at 5% or at 2%. You can calculate, based on a number of assumptions, how many surveys that you would need out of a given population to have a degree of confidence in the results. I'm suggesting, I mean, there is a number, and if I plug in the numbers of the households or of the population that I've been told, somewhere in the range of 320 to 350 survey responses would give a pretty high degree of confidence in the results. However, I also think that we need to be careful about relying too heavily on that social scientific sort of formula, in that it could be for our purposes that what I'll call now sort of representational accuracy may not be the most important criterion for you and for us going forward, in part because I think the question is more a political one than a scientific one, in that it really has to do with what are the kinds of interests and the degrees of interest amongst the residents in Little Compton, and what might be either the opportunities for will formation or the obstacles to that. And we might not get a whole lot by just finding a true average, which is kind of what these statistical surveys sort of look at. How many surveys do you need to know what the average speed of the cars are on a particular highway? And then you have confidence in that as an average. But for the work that we're doing, which is sort of organizing people and evaluating the viability of a way forward on a project, it could be that extreme responses are as important as the average. Those people who are kind of activists and will sort of get on the bandwagon, sort of be part of the project, it could be that their voices, including those who might be detractors, are more important, and they help us tell the story of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so I throw out this number of 320 to 350 because it sort of fits in the scientific literature. But I think because of the nature of our work here, that might not be the most important thing. And on that note, unless there are any sort of responses that you, or questions or thoughts that you'd like to share with me, I'd like to share my screen and just kind of step us through the questions, and then you can form a first impression, and then later you can study it more closely and send us email questions. And if this is headed in the right direction, we can make the survey serve the purpose that we want it to serve. Is that a fair next step for me to go? Okay. So the screen that I'm showing now has got two depictions of the first question. One as it would appear on a web page, and the other as it would appear on the phone. And you can see in both, there's kind of a progress bar that's often associated with people actually completing a survey because they get a sense of how far they have to go before it's done. And you'll also get a sense of how the survey sort of progresses through these initial kind of about you questions. What are the things that distinguish you as a resident of Little Compton? What are the things that sort of allow us to create some sort of demographic profile as to who you might be, and perhaps associate that with the interests and the options that you're considering? And for the moment, I'm going to just answer no here, because in this particular case, it triggers a conditional question, which is, well, if you don't live in Little Compton for the whole year, are you one of those who just spends the summer? So if you answer yes here, you don't get that question. But if you answer no, you will. And so I click no in this case, and I forward the bar. And you'll see with the little sort of plus sign that this is kind of a branch question off of A. Do you live in Little Compton only during the summer? And then there's kind of a series of questions, and this is all sort of open for amendment and sort of real evaluation as to, is this going to be valuable background information for us? We don't want to overwhelm people, but we want to collect information about important things. And you might know more about this than Annette and I do because you're closer to the project. So what we're proposing is a question for how many years have you regularly spent time in Little Compton? How many members of your extended family, including you, regularly spend time in Little Compton? And right now I have it set so that there's 3 questions on each page, but that can be modified depending on how you want the survey to proceed on the phone and on the web. We have an age question. We have a question about how large your immediate household is. And then we have some questions about your role. Does your household rent, own, or other its primary residence? This may be important information, it may not. I think it's something worth discussing and debating for what our actual purposes are. What do we want to learn from the portion of the town that provides responses for us? What is your annual income? Whether you're a renter, landlord, or something else. And then this is where you can see with the lowercase letters that we're sort of shifting into section 2 of the survey. I suppose we could even number it like 2A, 2B, that might help people understand the progression through the survey. And this is the first place where I'm really asking people to provide an assessment of what might be gained through an active plan to expand the availability of affordable homes in the town. For example, if we were to make an effective plan that did that, would it be most valuable for us because it supported state goals and needs, or some of these other ones? And what this allows you to do is to move it. So you're asking people to say, this is what I think is most important. And that will allow us to create some sort of graphs that show a connection between other variables and what are kind of the motivations, what are the aspirations, what are we getting out of working together on this particular project. And it also includes a question, which if you move the other one here into any other place than the last place, then you're provided with an option to say what that is. What additional goal or concern might you include in the ranking? And so it could include, for people who are willing to put that effort into it, some further thinking beyond what came out of the interviews and allow us to get some sense of the community in its entirety, or at least those who are responding, about what we might achieve through this. The next question is just kind of wide open, and I'm a little bit on the fence as to whether it will slow people down in the survey or not. But of course, at some point, there might be some value in getting free-flowing text, not just responses to multiple choice questions. What are your main hopes and or fears for housing availability in Little Compton? We can keep that question, we can reword it, but in some sense, it's what I'm getting at with the ranking order question, and here's a space in which one could get that in prose rather than just in numbers. I'm going to stop here for a moment and just ask if you have any questions or concerns about the approach so far.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things that I'm noticing a lack of is numbering the pages that you're showing us.
So one of the things that I probably need to confess is that I'm learning the intricacies of displaying surveys through Qualtrics myself a little bit now. So each time I approach to these surveys, I'm learning something about whether headings can be included. There is an option for numbering the questions individually. I haven't yet found an option for numbering the pages. There may be. I don't know at this point within this software whether that's a standard feature.
Just numbering the questions would be great, because I can't go back to a question that I want to discuss with you because I can't see a number for it.
Okay, so it could help. And one of the things that Annette and I have sort of been working on, especially at the end, is creating identifiers like that. And it could be that it actually would be valuable to just add like a 2A and a 2B. And that would mean that every question had an entirely sort of distinct ID number to it. And so you'd know which section you were in, and you'd know what sub-question you had within that. And I actually think that that would be a great improvement of the survey. And I will do that forthwith unless there are objections to my doing that at this point, because I think that's a simple solution and I think it would improve the presentation.
I agree.
But
I have other questions. You know that page where you showed us that you move?
I'll go back to it, yeah.
Oh, thanks. There's no directions to say how to do
Move
that.
it, right. And I think I need to do that, is use your mouse, and I have to actually sort of test it as to how it would function on the phone so that people, you know, when I did it, you saw that it was easy to do, but
Right.
the question doesn't suggest to you that you should use the mouse and click on one of these things and then move it up and down. And
Exactly.
rather than just say, please rank order the options,
Right.
I think I need to do that for the survey. I
Okay.
agree.
I know Netflix, you can do that with Netflix for
Mhm.
DVDs.
Yeah.
The other thing was right off the bat, you didn't, I would like to see people surveyed that actually don't live in Little Compton, but work here, but can't afford to live here. And
Yeah.
I think their responses would be valuable.
I agree with you, and I'm sort of want to open the floor for others to speak as well. I think that might actually, we maybe need another question of that sort. You know, do you live, and then do you work in Little Compton?
Exactly.
And then be sure as well. I mean, that's another thing for us to discuss. Like, what are the address lists that we have? Because ultimately, it will be easiest for us to distribute this through either email addresses or cell phone numbers. And then we need some sort of database as to who we're targeting that way. And if we're targeting more people than are officially listed as residents, we need to figure out how to reach them. So one, there's adding the question, which is,
Do you live in Little Compton?
right, and do you work at least part-time or something like that in Little Compton? So
Right.
that we have that as a data point. That's easy enough to include. I'll do that. So I'm making notes now, and that's a third thing that I will add because I agree with you entirely. And then the second thing is for us to think about how do we reach those people.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for your question. Really helpful.
I'm wondering, Per, if we could offer it to the employers in town and ask them to share it with their employees.
We can certainly do that. There are two different ways of distributing the survey. One is by just having sort of personal invitations, and then the responses are actually coded in response to people that we know ahead of time. And that's if you've got a really restricted group that you want to get responses from. It's also possible to have something like an anonymous link that can be distributed through email. Then you have a little bit less control, like people could conceivably respond 2 or 3 times. So there's other dangers that come in there. But if you do it that way, you can send the link to someone who can then distribute it through their institutional email system. And so those are some of the distribution questions that it sounds to me like that probably is what we should try to do. Are there particular employers that we would like to target? Or where might we find a list of the ones that we think would be most helpful? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, could I only suggest this, that there are a number of employers in this town who are not themselves residents of the town.
Right.
And so in the case of landscapers or building contractors who may live elsewhere, but who do the majority of their work in this town, I don't know that not that their voices don't matter, but I think I would have this lean more toward those that have a connection in town in some way, shape, or form, and not just the place of employment.
In terms of who we even want to complete the questionnaire, because there's 2 ways that we can do it. One is we can just make sure that the people who respond to the questionnaire fit that characteristic. In other words, that they have a connection, that they live or that they grew up here, and that those are the people that we distribute the questionnaire to. The other way is to distribute it more widely, but to have a distinguishing question so that we can partition the data and we can look at it as a whole, or we can look at it for those who have a connection to the community versus those who just show up here to do various work. And I actually would encourage the second approach because I think we get more data that way.
I agree.
I also think that we're looking at 2 different issues there. If we confine it to folks who live in town, then we get, I think, valuable information about their opinions of affordability and whether it's an issue for them or not, and whether what solutions appeal to them. But I think we miss most of the need. Because you're asking people who already have homes, who already live in Little Compton, and some of them may have financial issues and have housing needs, but many of them would not. And we're missing the whole issue of people who may work in town or people who may just have family and friends in town who would like to live in town and can't because of affordability issues. So I'd like to see some way to get at that broader issue as well.
Right, I agree with you. And that speaks towards the second approach, which is creating questions that allows us to sort of flag and mark who those people are, and then find some way to get at least some representative sample. It may be that printed copies are going to be easier there because or we need to do a little bit more active outreach, and eventually we can talk about what our strategies might be. Since I think what I heard and I don't know everyone's name, Patrick's response is that there aren't a lot of centralized employers that we could sort of use to distribute this. And so we're going to need to do sort of more of a network approach where people sort of refer it to each other, or that it's in a place where people might gather and they're sort of willing to share their voice on this particular matter. That'll take some thinking about how to operationalize that, how to do it.
Well, there is that first group that you talked about, Per, that there are employers in town, namely the town itself, that employs people that don't live here. Right. There's the school department, there's the police department, the fire department, the community center. So anyway. So
it could be, and I'm sorry to be interrupting you, so I'll step back again in a moment, but we could have some question which asks if you're associated with any of what you just now have identified as some primary employers in town, including the city itself, or whether their employment is independent of those employers. And then we could use those employers' email system to be sure that we at least get some responses from those workers.
Okay.
I was going to say, I do think that it would suggest, and maybe you, Perry, you were saying this, some companion questions where we would branch, because the way this particular question is asked, if you are not a person who is already living there, I think it would need to be worded differently or have a whole other set of choices, honestly.
I agree. And so this might be one of these where there's kind of a pyramid, or there's a, you start with a very basic question, and then based on that response, you get more specific ones. And at least we recognize there's two main categories. There are people with probably salaried positions through the institutional employers in town, including the city and the school district. And then there are people who are more like contractors, or who are working for contractors. And it could be that the types of questions that we want to ask those two groups are different. And Annette and I think, I'm speaking for both of us here, will reflect some on how we might set up a sequence of questions to get the kind of information that we would want about both groups. Does that sound like a sensible and valuable thing to do? Okay.
Yeah, but are those the only two groups that we want to go after? Because we also have a lot of agriculture in town, where a lot of workers come in from outside of town. The fishing industry is pretty good size employer in town.
Yeah, no, I would think agriculture figures largely, fisheries, the contractors, the contract workers that Patrick mentioned, as well as the municipal employees. I do believe there are some small retail places there also, right? Cafe, ice cream.
Builders, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I'm grateful for you sort of bringing up those categories, because I think that that's a manageable amount. And then we could have an other as well for things that we've missed. So right now I'm sort of thinking city, municipal, contractors, agricultural, fishing, retailer. And you can certainly email us if you think of other ones sort of after this meeting, because I think those are important groups. Now, how different our questions would need to be for each of those, I haven't really thought about that question yet. So if you have ideas about that, please do share it with Annette and me, either later in the meeting or later by email.
And I'm sorry, just one more, not to belabor the point, but nonprofits. There are a number of nonprofits in town that hire a lot of folks, and I know a lot of them don't necessarily live in town either. A lot of them do hire folks from town, but I think they're a good industry or a good group that we might want to include. So
thank you for including that to the list. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to go through most of the other questions so that you get a sense of it all. I've really appreciated this back and forth right now. It feels like this is the work that we're doing. But for me to sort of wrap up my conversation, then we can go back at various points. Let me just show the rest of how this thing flows. Is that fair with everyone? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to move to the question that we were already at, which added the additional goal, and then this sort of wide open question of what are your main hopes and fears. And then I switch, I think, to another section here, which we've called, in our draft, we had a title for it, but haven't found a way to make it show up in the survey, and I forget exactly what the category is. Do you remember, Annette, what our third category was? Somewhere I have it. But it was sort of a description of what are some of our concerns as a living in Little Compton. And it's just sort of a range of things that may be related to either housing needs or an interest in being part of this project. Are you a caregiver? Do you need or use a caregiver? And many of these came from the interview. People were you and others suggested these as things like, this might be important to the project that we're working on. Do you need proximity to the town center? Do you need transportation for groceries or pharmacy? Are you or anyone you know having problems? And this sort of opens then a series of questions in which we invite those people who may have more particular knowledge to share some of that with us. So that if you answer here yes, then you start to get a few follow-up questions.
And not to interrupt, but this was called experienced and known needs.
Okay, that was the category. Thank you, Annette, for looking that up for me. Experience and known needs. And so if you are willing to sort of say that you know someone who is having difficulty with housing, then we offer some categories. Someone you know in Little Compton or you is having difficulty affording essential monthly expenses, staying in an inherited family home, living close to their workplace, providing school continuity for their children, and other. And I think that this is one where you can choose multiple ones. Let me just double check. So we sort of collect what is the range and what might be the concentration and open the spot. And this could be a place too where you could, even right now, if something's on your mind, suggest an additional line that we could add of ways in which you think people could be pressed or could be challenged by the housing situation presently. But we thought that this was better than having just an open text box, like what kind of problems, because it sort of structures the thinking a little bit. And then if you happen to choose other, then you're given a chance to say what other housing related difficulty have you or someone else had.
That's good.
Okay. And then the second one is another kind of approach. It's trying to collect the same kind of information, but it's asking a more descriptive context. Have you had any conversations in the last year about housing affordability challenges here? So it's really getting at the same kinds of issues, but it's approaching it from a different angle. And so that if you say that you have had a conversation like this, then you're presented with a question, what do you remember having said, heard, and or felt on that subject in a conversation that remains vivid to you? And none of these are required ones. So people can sort of spin past it. You don't have to answer it. It doesn't like suddenly say, tell us your cell phone number, the way that these forms on the internet don't let us submit the form until we've done it. But if someone is willing to share this story, it seems like it would be valuable for us to hear. And then I think we go on to another section, and this is really the last section. Annette, go ahead. You're mute, I think.
Yeah, I was just gonna cheat and look at what we call this last section. So actually we have two more: personal experience living in Little Compton, and then the last one is strategic plan and considerations. So what we're at right now is personal experience with living in Little Compton.
No, actually wrong, Annette. What has happened here, is this. We have 5 sections. We just finished up the third one, which was experience and known needs.
Sorry.
We jumped here to the 5th one. Why did we jump? Because the 3rd one was sort of these conditionally targeted questions, which I didn't think to plan ahead for in my presentation, which were if you were older than 60. So you were in the 2 highest age brackets. There's an open-ended question, what kind of thing would you need to be able to stay in Little Compton? And so I could go back and I could check that, and then it would show up in section 4. And then there's a few other, so let me go back actually and check.
Can we do that, Per? Because we asked the ADU question in that grouping.
Yes, and this was one of the ones that I didn't think to trigger ahead of time. So let me do this.
I just want to warn everybody, if you're tempted by creating a survey in Qualtrics, don't do it alone, okay?
It's taken us a little bit of work. So one of the things here is if you're a landlord, then we ask a follow-up question. And another one was if you're older than 60. And the other one is if you own. So now let's go back to section 4. And I wish there was a way to just jump between the sections, but in this preview mode, there's not. So we'll just sort of zoom through here. Okay, so now we're gonna go to, and what was the title for it again, Lou? And not Lou, Annette? You're muted again.
Personal experience with living in Little Compton.
And so these are the ones that are sort of triggered by particular characteristics. So the first one is, if you were over 60, do you need or anticipate needing support? Oh, I got the wording wrong there. Needing support or
That's okay.
opportunity
They
to stay.
understand what we're saying.
Okay. And then the second one is, if you're a landlord, and this here is not really super well developed because it's a text entry question, and I'm saying there may be questions that we want to ask, but it's kind of tricky to know what would be valuable for us. What do you charge for rent? How many square feet? How many rooms? And I'm not really suggesting that as the form of this question, but if we are interested in collecting that information, we might need to create a series of multiple choice questions, like what's the range of the rent and what's the range of the square footage and how many rooms. And then we could collect, but we have to decide, do we need that information? Is that important for what we're trying to do? And so I put that in as kind of a reminder. Does that make sense?
And I do want to let people know through the interviews, it seems that there is some sort of a informal network of rentals in town that, according to the interviews, get circulated by social media, word of mouth. They're not necessarily things that, you know, show up in Craigslist or other ways that people might find rental housing. So it was really unclear how to ask the question, but are people here in agreement that there is such a network of rentals in town?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it's not very effective. I mean, it doesn't help
I'm
some
not saying
people.
it's effective. This was just a way to kind of root out what we were hearing as, you know, I'll just say qualified as a rumor almost.
Yeah, no, that's true.
I actually think expanding this question is going to be really important for us because I think it gets at this thing that is a theme that does show up in your summary of the interviews, which is I do think that there's a perception, or at least I've heard a perception in town that's like, we do have affordable housing, it's just not official. And I think that putting some more, I don't know, getting some more data around that, I think is really important for our work because, and I think asking the question, how do you make this rental available would be, I mean, I'm not wording that well, but like, you know, how do you advertise the rental opportunity? Would be a good thing to ask people. And I think it's really important to ask what people are charging for rent too, because I think this is like, it's like people say, oh, it's affordable, but we don't know what that means. So I think that question, or that, I agree that could be maybe expanded.
Okay, that's really helpful to
Could I
hear.
also add there that there are many homes in this town which are rented weekly. So we may want to qualify the length of time that a house is rented. I guess it all sort of opens up a bigger question, because once you start talking about cost versus square footage, you also start talking about amenities. And I don't know how far down that road we want to go in such a survey.
Right.
So would it be helpful to ask if this is a year-round or seasonal rental? Because I
Yes.
can imagine that there's a lot of Airbnb or other sorts of short-term rentals, you know, people who even, you know, vacate their own home to go other places and rent their house out for the 2 weeks that they're gone on vacation, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think that I don't know, but my hypothesis is that impacts our overall affordability quite a bit. And I think that having some information about vacation rentals or short-term rentals would be really helpful.
That's great. Detail and also just sort of level of interest, sort of the signal to me that this is an important path to go down. And so I am marking this as something worth further attention. So I'm going to develop another draft and share that with you later, in which I propose some more specific multiple choice format questions with category. And we decide which of those are the things that would be most useful for us. Any other thoughts on that before we go forward? That's really helpful in pinpointing that as something worth pursuing. And finally, there's really three main branches in this targeted question. These are for people who say that they own a property. And so the question is, might you be willing to develop an accessory dwelling unit on your property? And in this case, I decided to make the two choices, maybe and no. And then if you choose maybe, then there's, I think, one further question that we ask. If you develop an accessory dwelling unit on your property, to whom would you be willing to rent it? Only family or known persons, anyone who needs it, would be willing to restrict to persons with low or moderate income. And there might be other categories that we could add here. Do you think that this is a worthwhile question to ask for people who say that they own property?
I think so. I think I would define accessory dwelling unit in the question.
Oh,
Good point.
And if I'm not mistaken, the town actually has an ordinance, so I don't know if it would be worthwhile parenthetically putting in the ordinance number if people thought that was helpful for people to refer to.
So yeah, the ordinance is a accessory family dwelling is how it's listed. Additionally, the necessary deed restriction, it would seem to me to be difficult. Obviously, the deed for a piece of property covers the entirety of the property, right? And so I don't know as to the complexity of how a deed restriction for just one dwelling unit on that property, how that would work. I guess all things.
I will tell you, it is a complex document. They have them in Barnstable County. I was on a webinar last week that looked at these, so they can be done. We just thought that, you know, just again, this is information gathering, whether people think, but we can eliminate that part of the question as well.
I guess I only feel as though the question sort of belies the complexity behind it. And it might almost encourage false hope about this being a bona fide solution, you know? And one of the things I haven't seen yet, not critically, but is the idea of the town itself having some burden or some large stake in developing affordable housing. And so perhaps a question related to, should the town have a larger part in this conversation?
When we get to this last strategic planning piece, look at those choices that may be where they need to be beefed up. So,
okay.
So let me
in
show.
that initial question of, you know, why should you be doing this? One of them was support state goals and needs, but we could reword that, or we could add a choice there as well.
Yeah, back on the issue of the accessory dwellings, I think the question is important because a lot of people have talked about that as, oh, you know, that might be the solution for Little Compton. And as you've pointed out, it's very difficult. You know, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it would be important to ask what kind of interest there is out there. I mean, if this is something folks want to do, then maybe there's a solution to some of the obstacles to getting it done. But, you know, I have heard people kind of say, oh, well, you know, we could solve the problem by doing accessory dwellings, but maybe that's not the case. And maybe very few people would be interested in doing it. So this question kind of gets at that, I think.
So Sue, would you recommend keeping the one choice around the restriction or not?
No, I think the question is good. I would define what an accessory dwelling is, but
Okay,
I think it helps us get at some information or just some, opinions about it from people in town.
Is any of you willing to sort of throw out a draft definition of what we might mean here by an accessory dwelling? So if we were to define it or describe it more closely.
well, I mean, there is a legal definition from the state that we could use. Is that right? I mean, that's what we should use. Has its own egress. Could be attached to the main dwelling or an accessory building.
That might make the question too heavy, I mean, if we get
Okay.
legalistic, then it bogs it down. We want people to understand what we're talking about, and maybe it's better through an analogy, like an in-law apartment, or and maybe there's some other forms that we could name, so that through illustrations we sort of show people ways in which this could be, rather than drawing back to sort of a legalistic. I think that would be more helpful to draw out more meaningful responses. Are we? I mean, we could just sort of have a section, sort of a separate dwelling, like an in-law apartment. Would that be a sufficient way of defining what we're looking for, in your opinion? Something like that?
Yeah, I think just a very simple definition. You could even put in parentheses, such as an in-law apartment, a separate unit with a separate entrance, just so people have an idea of what you're talking about. I think that would be sufficient.
I will work on that. So the next draft will include a version of that. So let me show the final section here, which really just consists of 2 questions. So this is the 5th section, focused on strategic plans and consideration, and it uses a different type of question format that can actually be presented differently. There are different ways in which it can be visualized. This is the one which I thought is most useful, but you can also see the significant difference between the web version and the phone version, where you get the different strategies. How well suited are the following strategies to Little Compton's, oops, I got some punctuation correction there to make, to Little Compton's needs. And then there's a list of sort of 6 ways in which we might do this. And then we say it's very well suited or poorly suited. And maybe I actually should change the order so that poorly suited is on the left and very well suited is on the, so there are adjustments like that. But the main thing is to sort of relative to each other, how much energy maybe should we try putting into this as a solution. And you can see the way that it looks in the phone. You just sort of download by hitting on that chevron, and then for each individual one, you can make the choice. But the question here really is, and then it has a text entry at the bottom, what other action or strategy do you think best suited to improve housing affordability in Little Compton? And I think this is the final question of the survey. But what really matters here is the choices of the elements. And this is where I think perhaps we can discuss, like, is this representative? It came out of the interviews. So, I mean, these were some of the possibilities that sort of came up in those discussions. But we're not obliged just to mechanically reproduce what people said in the interviews. We want this to reflect the range of possible paths that we could take, and sort of to gather people's opinions on the viability of those in comparison to each other.
And so Patrick, I wanted to ask you, what specifically were you wanting to ask? Was it that you want the town to take responsibility?
I guess a question that would ask the survey, those being surveyed, to what extent does the town itself have a role in this process? And one thing I might point out, Per, is this: on that first question, I think it hits a brick wall for this reason. The word development is used. Housing development is toxic. So I might suggest something like allocate a portion of agricultural trust funds for affordable housing or
Oh,
support affordable housing.
Or have just housing affordability,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
then it could be kind of open-ended.
yeah, I agree with you fully. You're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing that out.
I would
Um,
also ask about the wording on the second question on the agricultural trust. I feel really strongly that there are lots of opportunities to work with them on the allocation of land or homes, but it's not always really about repurposing residents, which gets into a whole different, I think, legal question, and people who have left their home to the agricultural trust with the intent that it be used for agriculture or whatever. And, you know, there's one thing about going back and repurposing that, which is much more difficult for folks to accept. But there's another approach, which is as they are negotiating to purchase properties, to work with the housing trust or work with housing groups to allocate an existing home on the property or some portion of land that would be suitable for building or something like that. I don't know how we word that in a way that I think the repurpose is kind of lighting a fire under it.
Got it. Yeah, I can see where it's not serving our purpose of inviting people to see this as
A partnership, working as a partnership going forward or something to that effect.
I also feel as though two pointed questions regarding the Ag Trust almost seems as though it's an attack. And I wouldn't want it to be characterized in that way. Because I think it's crucial that we work together and not come across as being in opposition.
So there are two distinct questions here, though, which very clearly came up pretty universally in the interviews. One of which regarded the funds that are already automatically allocated.
Mhm.
And so I think there were interviewees who didn't necessarily want to question the mission around agriculture and conservation, but it was more like, can you please just share your funds so we can go about and do our thing? And the other aspect was, as Susan was talking about, you know, really creating a partnership as it relates to, you know, what are those holdings that they are given. So, I mean, we could collapse this into one question that's really, you know, very bland almost, where, you know, do you believe there's a role, you know, either financially or with holdings for the agricultural trust, but then you wouldn't be teasing out which one of those is true. And maybe that's fine. Maybe it's just really about taking a temperature on how many people really feel like, wow, we're doing a lot with the agricultural trust. You know, maybe we should balance that more with the housing trust.
So it occurs to me as you're speaking, Annette, that we could do something here like we've done before, which is we could make the answer on that sort of very general, is there area for cooperation between the agricultural trust and the housing trust? And if somebody says, you know, developing that would be well suited for our plan, so they've already kind of said something like that is good, then we could have a follow-up set that maybe had those two questions, which is this a way in which that partnership could work? Is this in other words, make a conditional matrix set of questions that's triggered by somebody saying, giving a positive answer on that more general state. What do you think about that as an approach? I mean, it takes away from the simplicity of this single table.
Yeah, I mean, I think we start to get into, well, I mean, this is for all of you to think about, right? And I don't want to pretend like, you know, we're going to take all the notes and have the, you know, precise survey tomorrow. You know, I do want you to all think about this. I think Per and I, you know, can input the edits that we've received tonight and get a new link out to you by Monday, so that then you can ruminate with it a little bit more. But but these are all things that would be already reflected. But as far as this question is concerned right now, do you want it collapsed into one question about a role for cooperating with the agricultural trust?
I would advocate for that. But I'm just one voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be better. I kind of agree with Patrick. It kind of looks as if the agricultural trust is kind of under attack there, especially leading off with it. At the very least, I'd put it further
Right.
down the list and on
Right.
options for folks.
I'm wondering if, I think I am inclined to agree as well. But I'm thinking about the desire to have those two kind of separate issues. One is the funding and one is the buildings held by the trust. So, but I sort of think that first question, you could word it differently so that it wasn't really as if we were taking money out of the agricultural trust fund, but
Mhm.
instead to say, allocate a portion of real estate transfer funding to the housing
Mm.
trust. So
no.
it's not about that is one of the current major sources of funding for the ag, but it's not about like taking money out of their trust, which
Right,
I don't think.
I mean, we could actually just say, would you support any sort of a town fund, to increase the resources for the housing trust?
I think that's maybe a better way to put it. Also,
Okay.
that first suggestion, that's not something that the town has direct control over. It would require state legislation to change the funding formula.
Mm.
Oh, that could be done at the town meeting, though. It has before.
No,
No.
you
No,
can't.
you need to have enabling legislation.
Yeah, you can't repurpose the ag trust funds.
Their money, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could change the funding amounts, however.
Yeah, exactly. You can change how much-
They can change their percentage of tax, but they cannot change how those funds are spent. That's declared in their enabling legislation. I would be very careful on how you word that one. And this is
Yeah.
Carol speaking in case you don't realize. Because that would require going back to the General Assembly to amend the legislation. I think you already have open communications with the Ag Trust. They're very willing to work with you on future possible purchases. They've said that in their meetings. They're just waiting for you to interact with them a little bit more. So I'd be careful on how much you do with what is perceived as an attack on them.
I
Thank you.
certainly wouldn't want us to be perceived as attacking them at all.
No, I wouldn't want you to either, because I know
No.
you just want to work with them, and in a sense, you're jealous that they have so much money, but I don't know that this is the method to go about changing it.
Yeah.
I agree.
I think maybe the second question there about repurposing the residences, I would get rid of the word repurpose, but maybe restructure that to talk about, to work with the agriculture, for the housing trust and the agricultural trust to work in a partnership to acquire properties, acquire residences or property suitable for residents, something like that, something about a partnership.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
I think in point of fact too, that the Ag Trust does not own houses. And what they do is acquire open space, and that's what they're chartered to do. So should there be a dwelling unit on a large parcel of property, it then gets subdivided. So I'm not aware, at least, of any houses that the Ag Trust owns. So I think it's kind of a moot point anyway. I don't think that they could really repurpose because they don't own any buildings.
Okay, so what
So
I'm
that-
hearing is the first choice is going to be changed into some form of a question about ensuring that the housing trust, is allocated funds from a local source by the town. And the second question would be, to work in partnership with the Little Compton Agricultural Trust to acquire properties for residential purposes.
Yeah, acquire or identify properties for residential purposes, maybe.
Affordable, housing affordability, as Susan said.
Yeah.
I think that's better.
Would it be, I know the transfer tax thing is like touchy and also requires enabling legislation, but my understanding of it is that like we're our community to say that we wanted that to adjust the transfer tax, that the state legislatures would support that change. So would it be useful for this survey to be a place to kind of gauge temperature for that?
Well, without going to the General Assembly to amend it to include that change in tax to be used for the housing trust, it wouldn't do you any good to change the tax. Because the legislation is very clear that it must be for the mission of the Ag Trust, which is conservation, open space, preservation of development rights, all of that stuff has nothing to do with affordable housing. So changing the tax won't do you any good for the housing trust.
I would also stay away from something as complicated as the transfer tax. Given the range of the people who we want to engage in this, I'd like to keep it at a kind of more basic level.
Could I also point out the question about reduced length of deed restriction required for affordability designation? It would seem to me that that's something beyond the scope of what we're actually able to do also, right? And that's a HUD, that's a federal restriction, if I'm not.
No, it's a state law.
Okay, all right. But it is a 30-year minimum, right?
Yes, but you are not the only town who has that as an actual goal within their housing element in the comprehensive plan. And there are many state legislatures. And I'm not saying that if everybody says very well suited, that's happening. Again, it's about what the perceptions in the town are.
Okay.
I think on that one, I would put the length in the question so people know, because not to assume that people know the length of the deed restriction.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Reduce the length of restriction required from its current 30 years or something like that. Because not most people will not know what that is. I think
The tricky part about that is the way the law actually is written is it would prefer that things be leased for 99 years. It's by no less than 30 years. But if Susan's willing to live with 30 years, I'm willing to live with 30 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I just make sure that our questions are balanced, so we're not just asking. I know that that's in the comprehensive plan, so maybe it should be out there to see what people think about it. But back to Patrick's question about what is the town's responsibility, just reducing the requirements isn't, meeting any kind of housing responsibility. So I want to make sure we ask folks, get a sense of whether folks feel like as if the town really needs to do something about this issue.
And maybe that sort of starts, maybe that should be earlier and sort of just a general, but then it's also how and how.
Yeah.
The question regarding voucher programs for rent and other social services could perhaps introduce the idea of to increase the town subsidy to encourage housing affordability. So at this point in time, there are a number of town residents who receive tax subsidies for a variety of reasons. But I don't know that there's a specific tax subsidy for housing affordability.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is perhaps one way that people could show their desire for the town to increase or step up.
Patrick, I think there is.
There are town subsidies.
Yeah, I think there is already an exemption that can be applied for.
Doesn't create a voucher program.
No,
I mean, you're just talking about for low income homeowners, it reduces their
Yes.
tax. Yeah, that's a very different thing. This would be creating a program for rental purposes, actual vouchers.
okay.
Right. So we're asking, how would that get funded? That's what we're asking, right? And would the, where would that funding come from?
I think that question is actually valid for many of the things, right? I mean, any of these that come out to be at the top of the pile, this is just a first question for discussion that would then, have to really be vetted. Throughout the interviews, there were suggestions for, further meetings, a housing forum. One interviewee actually got back to me and felt that, we shouldn't even go ahead with the survey until we had a housing manual and more people really understood all of the ordinances and laws related to housing. So this is just going to scratch the surface and take a temperature, if you will, I think, of the town.
Yeah, okay.
So, this last section reminds me, Annette, a little bit about the article that you encouraged me to read early on in the process, in which an urban planner was sort of wondering about the value of creating surveys to ask ordinary people how to solve problems that urban planners have gone to school and have spent 20 years thinking about, and sort of wondering, is the ordinary person going to know how to evaluate the value of wide sidewalks or walkability in their neighborhood and how to achieve that? And it could be that we're on the cusp here, that this is sort of questions about how to do something at a policy level that kind of out of ordinary lived experience, you just kind of don't know how to, I don't know how to cook that soup. But we are still interested in getting some sort of sense of resonance as to what is it that people might gather behind or kind of see as reasonable. And maybe if we look at this final section as a way of gathering interest, or at least the ability to understand how it might work, that perhaps the information that we gather from it would be useful for us. What I picked up from your comments is that it's really important not to be blaming, not to be sort of using terms like housing development or repurposing that sort of push hot buttons. And I think all of the comments that I've heard are really useful because they sort of identify ways in which we could turn people off. And this might be an area, once we send out the revised version next week, where if you sort of think about rewordings or additional strategies or ways of describing the plans, that by either bringing it to the next meeting, I don't know how long we need to wait before we decide to move forward on this, or just sending it to us as input in our next revision. This is a place where we can certainly make it more readable, less offensive to more people, and ultimately more useful in being kind of a thermostat of what people are willing to get behind.
One thought, go ahead, Annette.
I'm just thinking, Perry, you're reminding me of the article that I sent you, so I should remind myself of the article. And I'm wondering if we could make this all much more streamlined and really change the question to be, would you identify partners? Would you identify policies, that are both things that you would favor versus things that are barriers. I sincerely believe that a lot of the reason that I heard from the stakeholders was, that they really wanted to, move ahead in a way that would reduce challenges to possible development. So I want to ask this in the most helpful way possible. Sorry, Susan, go ahead.
I was just observing that of the 6 questions, of the 6 kind of policy statements here that we're asking people about, we've got 2 around working with the agricultural trust. We've got 2 that to me are just how do we avoid having to do affordable housing under state law? And then we've got voucher and we've got small lots. I'm not sure we're really getting at increasing affordability in Little Compton in these questions very much. Maybe, I'm thinking about a question about being able to build something at a higher density, but just wording it that way is also going to be a hot button, kind of item. But I'm not seeing, I guess because it's not an easy solution, but I'm not seeing a solution to the affordability problem really addressed in these 6 statements.
I think that's a really great observation, Susan, and I agree with you. And I also think that thinking about this question as a taking of temperature of people's reactions to strategies is really helpful as a way to think about like how to organize this question. And so, I mean, you could put something on there that we would consider. I mean, I also don't want to scare people off and make it sound like we're suggesting a certain, like, building a high rise in Little Compton or something like that. But I do think that putting something that we perceive to be like a less popular option might not be the worst thing to do to find out if it's truly something that everybody's like, no way. You know what I mean?
And maybe it should be, and it gets at another question we had, is maybe the question should be, should the town of Little Compton encourage the, you would say, development construction of additional housing that's affordable to a broader range of residents, or something to that effect.
Right.
So it's general enough to not be, necessarily a zoning or whatever issue, but get a sense of whether people think the town should be involved in encouraging that.
And that would be another question asking about the town's responsibility. This is something.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking. It gets at that issue as well as that we need some development in order to address this issue.
Right. And even if people end up sort of putting thumbs down to it sort of across the board, well, that's information to us.
Yeah.
That's not a solution that there's a lot of support behind. I agree. So this question, I feel, really needs some work. And those are good next steps here. So I think perhaps what I will do is I'll keep in the next version, keep a version of this question and just do the minor wording, but then have another question that includes the broader considerations. Patrick, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
I wanted to point out the possibility that perhaps this or such a page could also serve an educational element. Some of what Isabel had pointed out, that to a large extent, I think what we have is a populace who don't know the rules of the road. What does it mean to be affordable? So perhaps as an introductory on such a page, the element of deed restriction and the amount of time necessary and the requisite subsidy could preface any questions. So as to educate the populace and say, here are the rules. What options would you prefer? And perhaps a list of options, or however that pans out. Only to say that I think that this survey could serve an educational purpose in that capacity.
I wonder Patrick, if you might be willing to sort of send me a draft of what that might look like.
I can try.
All right, I'd appreciate that.
Can I just make a point
Yeah.
that you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth item down, it says increase voucher programs. We do not have a voucher program.
Ah,
So there's no increasing them. We would have
Hmm.
to initiate a voucher program. And that's the only thing I see on this list that would help people immediately.
right.
Everything else is future. But there are a lot
Mhm.
of people in town that need help right now
Mm.
that are renters.
You know, I want to just put this out to the group because I'm looking feverishly at the housing chapter in the comp plan. And I don't know, you know, especially given the amount of consternation around this question, if we in the survey have kind of, you know, gone beyond the action itself. The action itself was to conduct a survey in order to evaluate the demand. This question kind of goes beyond that, right? This question kind of starts into some of your other actions in your plan, which are, you know, continue to offer tax relief, to update the affordable housing law, maintain an inventory of those units that whoever wrote the plan feel meet the definition of affordable housing but don't count toward it, implement a capturing existing housing program. So, I mean, the actions actually in your plan really don't speak to, actually there is one, explore cooperative acquisitions that meet the dual goals. I mean, allow mixed use development. Maybe if people think this makes more sense, is we could mine the housing chapter itself for those specific policies, to Susan's point, that would actually create additional housing, rather than those that, you know, reduce the length of deed restriction or, you know, capture units that are deemed to be affordable but don't really, you know, meet the state standard. Does that sound like, otherwise I go back to my idea of, you know, Susan's perception, observation rather, you know, partnerships, creation of units, Claudia's point, immediate need, and then I don't want to say negotiate with state, but, you know, there are observations regarding the subsidy programs, whether it's the state or federal programs, you know, that do not necessarily conform to areas without water and sewer, you know, which could be said of all real estate development, truly. So, but I don't want to go on too long. I realize we're over time and you've got the rest of your agenda to go. So I apologize if we've taken more time than we were allocated.
I'd like to thank you both for your time here tonight. I don't know if anyone has any follow-up questions.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to respond by email, maybe more sort of specific, but I'm thinking like we meet once a month. So I think it would be important for us to just think about, you know, if we need consensus on the survey, how do we make sure we can do that without it taking too long?
So what I'm going to suggest is that Pear and I can at least edit to the responses we've heard tonight. I'm going to suggest that Per and I take a little time with this very last question and perhaps give you as many as 3 kinds of options around it, including the 4th option of eliminating the question. And we can get that to you in a Word format, so it doesn't have to be, through Qualtrics, though you can have a link where you can look at it through a graphic interface. And then, it's really your timeline. If you feel that it's absolutely critical that people have this in their hands, by the middle of August, and then they have it for 3 weeks up to Labor Day. I don't know. That's the sense I've gotten of what your summer schedule is out there, but that's really up to you.
Patrick, there's no reason why you can't have a special meeting. You don't have to wait till the next meeting.
That's true. Thank you. Yeah. And perhaps this idea of the timing we could discuss further. I don't know that I wouldn't want to trade getting it quickly versus getting quality, so hurry up and get it done quickly isn't necessarily going to get the response that is best. I do feel very encouraged and very optimistic. And I'm very appreciative of the time clearly that you've put into this. And given the amount of time that we've talked about a survey in town, we are off to a tremendous start, and I'm very grateful for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so you will have something new from us by Monday. Okay?
That's terrific.
And then from there, we can go back and forth about refinements and timing. Okay?
Very good. Very good. Annette, thank you very much. And Per, thank you very much.
Nice to meet
Yeah,
you all.
thank you.
Nice seeing you all. Take
Yeah,
care.
bye.
Thank you.
All right. We have 8:30 people. The next item on the agenda, discussion of recommendations to make for the Charter Review Board. Andrew, could I ask you, is there something in particular you think that's pressing that we need to discuss in this evening?
Honestly, I wasn't really prepared to talk about this tonight.
I know that the charter review is a 2-year process, and I suspect you, as I have received emails from Mr. Jack Hare, who is chairing that charter review. Could we entertain a motion that this be tabled for tonight's agenda and put on next month's agenda?
So
Is that a
moved.
possibility?
Yeah, I would make that motion that we table this till
Yeah.
next meeting.
And
I second.
seconded? All in favor by consensus?
Aye.
Yeah, unanimous. Thank you. Number 6 on tonight's agenda is election of officers for the Little Compton Housing Trust. I would love not to be president of this organization. I know that we have, Isabel has been doing a wonderful job as secretary, for which I'm grateful. And Andrew has recently become the treasurer.
And not doing such a wonderful job.
I wouldn't say that, Andrew. Come on. No, it's, are there any motions to nominate anyone for any given position? Or are you going to make me step down?
Who are we missing? Bob?
Bob and Matt.
Matt
Bob and Matt Ladd, yeah.
There you go, nominate them.
Ladd.
Perfect.
Actually, Bob said he wouldn't want to have a position right now.
So if there's anyone who would like to have the position of chair or president, I'm happy to step aside. And I do feel as though there are those among us who could do a better job than I. So I would happily yield this floor.
I think you're doing a terrific job, and I can't step up right now. It's just bad timing. So maybe at some future date can help you out a little bit more, but couldn't do it right now.
Well, hearing no nominations, Claudia, I don't know.
Can we just ask that the slate remains the same? Can we move that? Can I move that?
You can, you just did.
You just
Just
did
need
it.
a- You need a second.
I'll second.
Oh, there you go. Motioned in second.
Oh, now we got to vote on it.
Mm-hmm.
Claudia McNeil,
Aye.
Isabel Mattia,
Aye.
Andrew Moore,
Aye.
Susan Bonington.
Aye.
I'm gonna abstain, one abstention. Duly noted. All right, next on the agenda is a discussion of moving our meeting time from 7 o'clock on Thursday evenings. I don't know how this came about. Does anyone like?
Yeah, this was my request, and I think I did indicate when I was being appointed to the board that just Thursday nights is a really bad time for me. So I'm wondering if there is another night that would work for everyone, other than Thursdays.
Mondays and Wednesdays are generally pretty good for me, if others are amenable to that.
And we're gonna have to meet in person, right?
After tonight, yes.
Yeah. That's gonna make a difference to some people.
I'm open. Wednesday would be a night where I wouldn't have a conflict generally.
Yeah, Wednesday's fine for me as well.
Wednesday's fine with me.
Works for me.
Okay, just so you know, for the council chambers, the fourth Wednesday, oh no, you can't even have that one. Wednesdays are not a good night for the council chambers. That doesn't mean that you can't use the old police station that may be available, depending on what week you choose your meeting to be on. We'd have to double check the calendar down there.
All right.
Where is that, Carol?
Yeah, what's that?
The old police station?
Yeah.
The Odd Fellows Hall?
The Odd Fellows Hall, the one with the gray steps in the front of the building.
Oh, the gray steps that haven't been fixed that were supposed to be fixed.
They did some repairs, but they didn't do enough.
I can
No.
bring a hammer with me.
Yeah, there you go. Make it a working meeting. So once I know what week you'd like for it to be, I can double check their calendar and find out whether or not that's available. If so, then you can make that change.
And is there an elevator in that building?
There is, but you wouldn't be going upstairs. Upstairs is only for the Odd Fellows use. You'd be
Okay.
downstairs on the first floor.
And is that handicapped accessible?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, it sounds like Wednesdays is a great option, and given that additional space, that could work out well.
All right. Do you have a preference for first, second, third, or fourth Wednesday in the month? Or do you want me to just check all Wednesdays and then report to you?
What's easiest for you, Carol?
I don't care. It really doesn't make a difference to me. I'm just going to check the calendar and I can let you know if all Wednesdays are open in the evenings or if there's any that are restricted, and then you can make your choice from there. You can make that type of a choice through email. It's not considered a meeting. That's not a violation. So we can do that.
I think if
Wednesday
we
might be
could, if we could aim for that week in between the town council meetings, that would be nice.
All right. Well, let me look then, and I'll shoot an email out to you all tomorrow.
Can I also ask, do people have flexibility with time? I'm starting to think that bedtime's going to be, baby bedtime's going to start being an issue for me soon. So I don't know if it could happen. Would 6 o'clock be a possibility for folks, or?
That I'd like it earlier anyway, especially during the winter. But
Carol, are there any other town boards that meet at 6 o'clock?
Oh yeah, they're all over the board. Some meet at 6, some meet at 6:30, 7. It's whatever you feel like.
I would prefer earlier as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
6 is good.
Great. That would be
All
great.
right. So I will check the calendar for 6 p.m. I'll check all Wednesdays, but I'll make special note of the one that falls in between each of the council meetings.
Okay,
Thank you, Carol.
Okay,
thank you, Carol.
you're welcome.
Carol, thank
Everything,
you
you
for
needed
all
one
the
more thing to
Zoom.
do, right?
Thank you, everyone, for being considerate about the date.
Carol, thank you very much for doing all the Zooms you've done in the past year.
You're welcome.
Past
Oh.
year, she's been doing it for 20 years.
The Zoom's been,
Yeah.
what, 18 months?
Right, that's too long.
We have number 8 on our docket tonight is correspondence, of which there is none, which leads us to number 9, and that is a motion for adjournment if we hear.
So moved.
Second,
All in favor?
I,
Aye.
Thank you so much,
Andrew,
everyone,
put your hand up.
unanimously. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Maybe we'll see you on one of these Wednesdays coming up.
Yeah,
yeah,
great. Good to
Thank
see everybody.
Bye.
Yeah.
Say hi to Ralph for me. So,
I will. Yep, bye.
bye-bye.
thanks.